The Forgotten Monster, Gerald Stano's Reign of Terror. For nearly a decade, from the early 1970s to 1980, a predator stalked the highways of Florida, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, targeting the most vulnerable members of society. Gerald Eugene Stano confessed to murdering 41 young women and girls, though police believe the actual number may be closer to 88. Despite being one of America's most prolific serial killers, sharing death row with Ted Bundy himself, Stano remains largely forgotten in the annals of true crime. This is the story of a monster made by neglect, whose reign of terror went unnoticed because his victims were society's invisible, hitchhikers, runaways, and young women that few people bothered to miss. The 1970s marked an era of unprecedented freedom and mobility in America. Young people hitchhiked across the country, trusting in the kindness of strangers. But this newfound freedom also created opportunities for predators. While the nation was captivated by high-profile killers like Ted Bundy, another monster was quietly accumulating victims at an even more alarming rate. Gerald Stano's story begins not with his name, but with his birth as Paul Zeininger on September 12, 1951, in Schenectady, New York. He was the fifth child born to his biological mother, and the third she would abandon to the state. The circumstances of his early life would prove to be a textbook case of how severe neglect can create a monster. The neglect Paul Zeininger suffered was so extreme that it defied comprehension. When his mother finally surrendered him for adoption at 6 months old, county doctors declared him unadoptable. They found a child functioning at what they termed an animalistic level, so malnourished and neglected that he was eating his own feces to survive. 4 of his biological siblings had already been given up for adoption, painting a picture of a family system in complete collapse. It was Norma Stano, a compassionate nurse, who saw past the damaged exterior and insisted on adopting the boy others had written off. She legally changed his name to Gerald Eugene Stano, and along with her husband, provided him with a loving home. But the damage from those crucial first months of life had already been done, setting the stage for a lifetime of behavioral problems. Despite his adoptive parents' love and dedication, Stano continued to exhibit severe behavioral problems throughout his childhood. In school, he earned C's and D's in most subjects, with music being his only area of excellence. His compulsive lying became legendary among classmates and teachers, including an incident where he stole money from his father's wallet to pay track team members to finish behind him, desperate to avoid being seen as a complete failure. Stano became a frequent target of bullying, which only exacerbated his psychological problems. At age 14, he was arrested for pulling a false fire alarm and later for throwing rocks at cars from a highway overpass, an act that could have killed innocent drivers. The rock-throwing incident was particularly telling, as it demonstrated a complete disregard for human life that would later manifest in far more horrific ways. Stano's academic struggles were so severe that he didn't graduate high school until he was 21 years old. After finally receiving his diploma, he enrolled in computer school and briefly found work at a local hospital. However, his inability to maintain employment became a pattern. He was fired for stealing from coworkers, marking the beginning of a cycle of theft and deception that would characterize his entire adult life. When Stano moved with his parents to Ormond Beach, Florida, his problems only intensified. Job after job ended in termination, usually for theft or chronic tardiness. But it was during this period that his violence escalated to its most serious level yet. He raped a mentally disabled girl, who became pregnant as a result. His parents paid for the abortion, another attempt to clean up their son's messes, unaware that far worse was to come. Officially, Stano admitted to beginning his killing spree in the early 1970s when he was in his 20s. However, he also claimed to have started as early as 1969 at age 18. Several girls had gone missing in Stano's area during that time, but insufficient physical evidence meant he was never charged for these early crimes. What is certain is that by the early 1970s, Gerald Stano had become a methodical killer. Stano's hunting ground was America's highway system, where young people routinely hitchhiked without fear. His victims were predominantly white women between ages 16 and 25, though he occasionally targeted African American women as well. He had, as one investigator noted, a way of selecting helpless victims who he knew he could overpower. The bodies of Janine Marie Ligatino, 19, and Anne Eugenia Arsenault, 17, were discovered stabbed to death in a vacant lot in Gainesville, Florida on March 21, 1973. This double murder marked the beginning of Stano's documented reign of terror in the Sunshine State. The brutality of these killings, 2 young women stabbed to death and discarded like garbage, would become Stano's signature. What followed was a systematic campaign of murder that spanned nearly a decade. Barbara Ann Bauer, 16, abducted from a shopping mall and strangled. Kathy Lee Scharf, 17, a hitchhiker found stabbed and strangled in a wildlife refuge. Susan Bazile, just 12 years old, lured from a school bus with promises of going to a skating rink. Each victim had a story, a family, dreams that were violently cut short by a predator who saw them as nothing more than disposable objects. Stano's method was disturbingly consistent. He would cruise the highways in his vehicle, looking for young women walking alone or hitchhiking. Using his non-threatening appearance and gift for manipulation, he would convince them to get into his car. Once they were isolated and vulnerable, his true nature would emerge. Victims were stabbed, strangled, shot, or drowned, their bodies dumped in remote locations across multiple counties. For years, law enforcement agencies across Florida struggled to connect the mounting body count. The crimes spanned multiple jurisdictions, and many victims were transients whose disappearances weren't immediately noticed. This was exactly what Stano was counting on. He deliberately targeted society's most vulnerable members, knowing their deaths would generate little attention or investigation. Stano's downfall came not from a sophisticated police investigation, but from a victim who survived. On March 25, 1980, he attacked Donna Hensley, a prostitute whom he had lured to a hotel room. During their encounter, Stano suddenly turned violent, stabbing Hensley 30 times before insulting her and fleeing the scene. Miraculously, Hensley survived the brutal attack and was able to identify Stano to authorities. On April 1, 1980, Gerald Stano was arrested based on Hensley's identification. What followed was one of the most extensive confession sessions in American criminal history. Detective Paul Crowe, who would spend the next 6 years extracting confessions from Stano, discovered they had caught far more than a simple assault suspect. Initially arrested for the attack on Donna Hensley, Stano began confessing to murder after murder. "I would find a girl walking," he told investigators with chilling candor, describing how he selected his victims. His confessions were detailed and specific, providing information only the killer could know about crime scenes and victim locations. As the confessions continued, the true scope of Stano's crimes became apparent. He admitted to 41 murders across Florida, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. Police believe the actual number may be closer to 88 victims. The FBI classified Stano as one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, yet his name remained largely unknown to the public. Stano was found guilty of 9 murders and received 8 life sentences plus 1 death sentence. The death sentence was for the murder of 17-year-old Kathy Lee Scharf, the hitchhiker whose body was found in the Merritt Island National Wildlife Refuge. During his time on death row, Stano was housed just cells away from Ted Bundy, 2 monsters who had terrorized America in parallel campaigns of violence. For 18 years, Gerald Stano sat on Florida's death row, occasionally providing additional information about his crimes to investigators. On March 23, 1998, at age 46, he was executed by electric chair at Florida State Prison. His final meal was an elaborate affair: Delmonico steak, baked potato with sour cream and bacon bits, salad with blue cheese dressing, lima beans, half a gallon of mint chocolate chip ice cream, and 2 liters of Pepsi. In his final statement, Stano proclaimed his innocence and blamed lead investigator Paul Crowe for coercing false confessions. "I am innocent. I am frightened. I was threatened and I was held month after month without any real legal representation. I confessed to crimes I did not commit." Whether this was the truth or a final manipulation by a master deceiver remains unclear. Even decades after Stano's execution, his crimes continue to impact families. In 2024, genetic genealogy finally identified one of his victims, Pamela K. Whitman, whose remains were found off Interstate 95 in 1980. Described by her Indiana classmates as having the voice of an angel, Whitman had been known only as a Jane Doe for 44 years until science finally gave her back her name. The tragedy of Gerald Stano's case extends beyond the murders themselves to the societal indifference that allowed him to operate for so long. His victims were largely hitchhikers, runaways, and sex workers, young women whom society often dismissed as undesirable or high risk. This indifference enabled Stano to accumulate victims at an alarming rate, while flying under the radar of both law enforcement and media attention. Stano's case fundamentally changed how law enforcement approached highway safety and missing persons cases involving transient populations. It highlighted the urgent need for better communication between jurisdictions and more attention to crimes against society's most vulnerable members. The story of Gerald Stano is a chilling reminder that monsters don't always come with the fanfare of media attention or the notoriety of household names. For nearly a decade, one of America's most prolific serial killers operated in plain sight, targeting young women whose disappearances barely registered in a society that had written them off as expendable. His confirmed victims, at least 23, possibly as many as 88, weren't just statistics in a criminal case. They were daughters, sisters, friends, and dreamers whose lives were cut short by a predator who exploited both their vulnerability and society's indifference. Janine Ligatino and Ann Arsenault, just 19 and 17, who died together in a Gainesville vacant lot. Barbara Bauer, 16, kidnapped from a shopping mall where she should have been safe. Susan Bazile, only 12, lured away with promises of skating. Each victim trusted the wrong person at the wrong moment, and each deserved protection from a society that should have been watching more carefully. Stano's ability to operate for so long wasn't just due to his cunning. It was enabled by a culture that didn't value the lives of hitchhikers, runaways, and other marginalized young women. The case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about whose lives we value and whose disappearances we investigate with urgency. It reminds us that true crime isn't just about understanding killers. It's about remembering victims, addressing systemic failures, and ensuring that no one is invisible to justice. Gerald Stano died in Florida's electric chair in 1998, but his legacy should serve as a warning about the dangers of social indifference. When we dismiss certain members of society as unworthy of protection, we create hunting grounds for predators. When we fail to investigate disappearances seriously, we enable killers to continue their sprees. If this story has opened your eyes to the importance of victim advocacy, highway safety, or equal justice regardless of social status, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Weird World Wonders. Every click helps us honor the forgotten, expose systemic failures, and ensure that stories like these serve as calls to action for a more vigilant and compassionate society. Because every life has value, every disappearance matters, and every victim deserves to be remembered.